Perspective this Wednesday evening. I'm Sipiso Makwetla. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, tonight we start at the United Nations, where it's in the midst of a cash crunch and has been forced to implement drastic cost-cutting measures to keep the organization operational. From cutting down to escalators to limiting official travel and reducing air conditioner use at UN facilities around the globe, as the Secretary General attempts to navigate the worst cash crisis the global body has faced in a decade. In mid-October, more than 60 countries owing almost $1.4 billion had yet to be received for the UN's assessed regular budget, including the UN's largest financial contributor, the United States, which owes $1 billion.
The United Nations boss went as far as saying they may not have enough funds to pay staff salaries next month. A situation exacerbated by the world's wealthiest country and largest UN financial contributor, the United States, that has yet to settle its $1 billion in unpaid dues in full.
The organization is facing a severe financial crisis. To be more specific, a severe liquidity crisis. The equation is simple. Without cash, the budget cannot be properly implemented. These months, we will reach the deepest deficit of the decade. We risk exhausting the closed peacekeeping cash reserves and entering November without enough cash to cover payrolls.
In a memorandum sent to managers, the UN boss laid out a series of emergency measures that include limiting official travel to the most essential activities, scaling back events that happen outside official office hours and on weekends, expenditure limits that include no new furniture or IT purchases, limits on new hires, while air conditioning and heating to be reduced outside the official workday.
Our work and our reforms are at risk. As I introduce the 2020 program budget proposals, I reiterate my call on you to recommit to paying your financial obligations on time and in full. And I thank those member states that have done so. I also thank those that continue to make every effort to do so, notwithstanding the difficult economic conditions they face. I equally urge you to consider measures to ease the structural impediments preventing us from managing the resources more effectively.
Additionally, escalators to floors already serviced by elevators have been shut down, while the Secretariat fountain, paid for by US school children and opened in 1952, has also been turned off.
We are looking at this in terms of all member states who are obliged to pay their contributions in full and on time. And we have been in touch with member states who owe significant amounts of money to the organization to see and to encourage them that we can have that cash forthcoming so that we will be able to meet our obligations, both for salaries and for vendors, by the end of the year.
Senior management has indicated that severe liquidity issues have become dire, with a growing downward trend, placing pressure on reserves despite measures taken to reduce expenditures.
I have to save every penny that I have to save. And what choices do I have? Do I say now, don't pay the air charter bills that we have to have for Afghanistan? That's the kind of call we are making on a daily basis. So we don't have complete visibility to say that I can pick and choose this one and say, this is going to save me X amount of money. Clearly, we're trying to say all the non-post costs, that anything that can be postponed to minimize the impact should be postponed so that we can see globally where we stand.
South Africa paid its budget dues of just over $7.5 million in February, while China, the second largest UN financial contributor, paid its $335 million dues in May. Sharon Bryce-Pease, SABC News, New York.
And our correspondent at the United Nations, Sharon Bryce-Pease, joins us there to talk a little bit more about this. So these austerity measures were put in place on Friday, October the 11th, and since then we've seen a flood of payment for more than 60 member states. Yet some still have to pay, the United States included, Sharon. So tell us a little bit more about that. What is likely to urge countries to honor this?
Well, I will just frame this in terms of the fact that we've been taking the stairs a lot here at UN headquarters, given the shuttering of those escalators on certain floors. And really, I think the appeal from the highest echelons of the United Nations, you saw the Secretary General in that piece. They marched out the Under Secretary General for Management, the person that is the controller in that department, really talking about the difficulties they face. And the Secretary General specifically speaking there about the inability of the organization possibly by next month being unable to fulfill their payroll. And I mean, this is now talking to the ability of UN staff to meet their obligations, their rent, their school fees and such. So this is a very serious situation. And as we correctly pointed out there, one of the biggest contributors, the United States, we understand, has now made a partial payment of $180 million, but that is only a small portion, Tsepiso, of the almost $1 billion that the United States has paid. It's a question we put to Stefan Dujarric, the spokesperson of the Secretary General, yesterday. Let's watch that exchange.
No new funds given in full, besides the ones from the Seychelles that we announced yesterday. We are continuing to work with member states to ensure as many payments come in before the end of the year.
And just to clarify, the United States, what's the engagement like there?
There's been positive discussions, and a number of member states have given partial payments. One of the problems was some countries have had their assessment increased, but by the time that went into place, the budget, their own national budgets, had not taken that into account. So, countries are explaining to us different reasons for late payment. We are obviously listening and trying to work with them.
So, Shoan, obviously the United States, much has been...
Tsepiso.
So I say much has been made about the United States financial muscle, it being the largest contributor to the UN, 22% of that to the regular budget, 28% to the peacekeeping budget. Have you had a chance to at least reach out to UN's United States mission officials to talk about this?
Yeah, and the sense you get from those officials is that they're being unfairly targeted here because they, as they sort of trumpet, the United States is and has historically been the largest contributor to both the regular budget and the peacekeeping budget. They they say, over $10 billion through not only here at UN headquarters and through the General Assembly, but through various agencies and aid operations that are organized and fueled by the United Nations. I did reach out to the mission here, Tsepiso. They sent me back a note saying that the amount that the United States owes is distorted because of the differences in the US and the UN financial years. You'll remember countries have to make payment to the UN by a January 31st deadline. We are almost in November. They continue to say that to date this year we have contributed over 600 million to UN peacekeeping operations and will be providing the vast majority of what we owe to the regular budget by this fall being autumn in the United States. We are now at the end of autumn and they are still owing more than $800 million.
Is there any kind of discussion around penalties for late payment, Shoan? Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, informally, Tsepiso, it was something that was raised by a colleague of mine in the noon briefing yesterday, and Stefan had an interesting response. Let's listen to that.
That would be something, collecting, that would be something for the member states themselves to decide. One of the structural issues, obviously, is that the UN, the Secretariat is not allowed to borrow money. So unlike, governments themselves, we do not have access to the international market where we could borrow some money.
United Nations Tsepiso,
where member states are accountable for their own good or bad behavior, right? And so essentially we have to ask member states whether they will create rules to sanction themselves for late payment. I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen in the near future.
All right, so final question now, Shoan. What you've spoken earlier about the budget cuts and what the effect of some of those have been. We've only seen an abbreviated version of that. Is there anything in particular that jumps out for you that's going to have an adverse effect?
I want to show you, this is the memo that the Secretary General sent out. It's 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long, and there's some appendixes on that document. The postponement piece of conferences and meetings, contractors or temporary contractual personnel, they cannot be hired anymore. The interpretation and document services are going to be reduced or limited. Remember, all documents at the United Nations are issued in 6 official languages. That turnover is going to be very slow. The documentation services are going to be restricted. Catering facilities in the building, the Delegates Lounge, which is a meeting place here at the United Nations, will close strictly at 5 p.m. every day. Security will only be from 8 during office hours. The building will be shut down during over the weekends, and sometimes they would have visiting tours coming in over the weekend. And this is the final kicker in this document. Expenditure patterns will be carefully monitored by the Department of Management to ascertain whether additional appropriate action may be required depending on the evolving liquidity situation. There you have it.
Right, thank you very much, Shoana. Of course, we will continue with this discussion about the UN and its operations, specifically here in Africa. That's after the break. Don't go away.
I'm nervous. It's okay to be nervous on your first day, but you'll make lots of friends, and I'll be here when you get back. With iWise Life Insurance, I provide for my family.
Get 1 million Rand cover from just 189 Rand per month with iWise Life Insurance. For a quote, SMS Live to 48853.
Go wonder in the new Ford EcoSport Ambiente with great features like 6 speakers and a full-size spare wheel. From only 3,499 per month with an 8% interest rate. Offer valid over 48 months, financed on Ford options through Ford Credit, an authorized FSP and registered credit provider.
Did you know the big hole digging started in 1871 and ended on the 14th August 1914? The hole produced 2,722 kgs of diamonds. However, one diamond as huge as 490 carat of stone found in the open prior 1868 gave them the interest to dig. Extracted from 22.5 million tons of soil. Today, the hole sits at a breathtaking 214 meters deep. Kimberley Big Hole attracts tourists from all over the world, taking a vintage tram past the city, then cycling around the Big Hole.
Welcome back. We're now joined by Nados Bekele Thomas, who's the head of the United Nations in South Africa, in our Pretoria studios. We talk about the United Nations, especially its role in Africa. The UN has about 17 agencies that work in this country. Ms. Bekele Thomas, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. So, with so many different mandates, how do you break the silos to create a UN system that is singular and unitary?
Thank you very much for having me. Well, yes, you're right. You know, there are 17 agencies here in South Africa, but there are many agencies also in the different countries. So, you know, the needs of the country defines the number of agencies that are present in different countries. Here in South Africa, you know, the need for coming together is a result of several issues. One is the dwindling resources, ODA declining over time, and the need to really make sure that we use our resources efficiently and effectively. The second reason why we have to work together is the fact that, you know, the world has adopted the SDGs, and the SDGs, in order to be realized, require a very interdependent, interlinked, integrated response. And therefore, the UN has to come together to respond and to realize these goals by working together as one entity and unit. We have to know that, we don't have a plan. Our plans, which we call the cooperation framework, is a direct derivative of the government's plan. And in order to respond to this government's plan, one thing that we have to make sure is that, the little resources that we have, and you have to know that, South Africa being a middle income country does not have the core resources that other countries benefit. So we have limited resources, and therefore we need to really use them very efficiently and effectively and respond to the priorities of the country, and also cut down the transaction cost for the government and for ourselves. So, a reason why we have to work together as one. And all these forces are pushing us to us working together, and you will hear later on from my colleague how even at the agency level, they bring other agencies to deliver on their mandates.
I want to talk about your mandate and the priorities that you mentioned. Who takes the lead on what the priorities are? You mentioned the SDGs. Is Africa as a continent allowed to at least dictate to the UN where they believe the priorities lie?
Oh, certainly, it's very, very important that we have to understand, like I said, the UN does not have its plan, The plan and the priorities are determined by the government itself. And, whatever our cooperation framework is going to be, we are in the process of formulating it. It is a direct derivative of the national plan. And from the national plan, we have a special, we have got prioritization retreat. And in that prioritization retreat, the government takes leadership and it indicates to us which areas they would like the UN to intervene. Therefore, leadership and ownership is bestowed on the government. And of course, we work not in silos. It's not only with the government, but in consultation with the civil society organizations, the private sector, the academia, the research institutions, the technology institutions, and also the vulnerable and marginalized societies who would express their needs, like women, youth, the people with disability. So all of us would together define the priority. But certainly, like I said, leadership would be, bestowed on the government because it's their plan and they need to deliver that with our support.
So as you say, your support is to governments, like in the case of South Africa. You speak also about the role of civil society and other sectors to promote and facilitate access to economic and social opportunities for all. But how do you fund those who are not at state levels, SCOs, civil society communities, to be able to reach those objectives?
All these stakeholders, I call them stakeholders and partners in development, we get together in delivering results for the citizens, for South Africans. Therefore, we work in tandem with civil society organizations. They are our major stakeholders, actually. Not only, the civil society organizations, but we work also with the private sector, the business community. We work with the research institutions. We work with all the actors that would together deliver on results. And that's what we call delivering as one. When we talk about delivering as one, it transcends the UN agencies, the 17 agencies working together. It encompasses all the other actors to deliver or results that are already stipulated and articulated in the development plans. No one entity can deliver the SDGs, and that has been clear. Yeah.
And different countries have different approaches. So let's talk about how you empower them, because that's ultimately the goal, that countries are self-sufficient in terms of development. So how do you empower countries to be able to self-develop? You'd ultimately, I think, want them to be self-sufficient. So are there any particular projects or programs that you are targeting to ensure that they are empowered?
Well, you know, it's very important, especially for South Africa. That is a middle-income country, and that has got the resources and the capacities, you know, to know that, you know, it is the prime responsibility is government to deliver these results. Yes, it cannot do it alone. It needs all the actors together, and we support. And you know, our support is more of a catalytic intervention. Using our convening power, using our expertise in bringing knowledge, global knowledge from outside, and also the specialized, you know, top-notch expertise that are available, bringing these expertise from the world, you know, to inform the processes, the development processes of this country. Yeah.
So we spoke earlier on about the financial downturn. What has been the impact on Africa, especially with regards to SDGs? Are there any programs that have suffered as a result?
Certainly it will have an impact because the SDGs require $3 trillion every year of investment to realize the SDGs. And, you know, it's very unfortunate at a time when we want to invest better, invest efficiently, and invest more, that, you know, these problems of resources is surfacing. It will have an impact on how the UN works, but, you know, from the programmatic perspective, like I said earlier on, a middle-income country like South Africa does not have any core resources. Not only it doesn't have core resources, the development cooperation in terms of bilateral agreements are not there. And we really depend on innovative ways of financing our programs. And the country needs a sort of a different way of funding arrangements. A blended investment is very critical and very important. Tapping on the resources that are available, you know, in companies, in the business community is very important and critical. The use of our resources is critical. We have to be able to use our domestic resources, and we have to manage our public expenditure. We have to seal the wastages and leakages and really curb on corruption. And make sure that, you know, we have business processes very well known, very articulated, and need be re-engineer our business processes to make sure that we deliver results to the people. And the most important thing is results for the people. Now, I will go back to what you just said on self-sufficiency. I think, you know, you're talking about, you know, how does our intervention become sustainable and to make people to be self-sufficient. In the case of South Africa, our aim is to really work with the communities and build their capacities so that they know how to produce results, you know, using the catalytic interventions that we bring on board.
Okay. So just a final question. Let's talk about multilateralism, multipluralism. Do you think the United Nations has done enough for Africa in this regard?
Well, you know, United Nations by itself is the platform for multilateralism. As you know, multilateralism is where the noble causes, you know, where there are shared vision and shared goals and shared values, and countries or member states, more than two, come together to deliver on results. So in the case of Africa, it really benefits from multilateralism. Yes, we know that there is a threat, but certainly this world will not be a better world unless nations come together, because the challenges are actually becoming more and more global challenges, global issues, be it terrorism, be it climate change, and even poverty is nowadays, is not just one country's problem, it's a shared problem. So, countries and nations coming together to respond to these common issues is very critical and very important if we want really and aspire to have the world which we want to build, which is a resilient, inclusive, and dignified world with dignified citizens.
Thank you very much for your time and speaking to us in our Pretoria studios. There is Nados Bekele Thomas. She is the UN regional head in Southern Africa. And of course, we'll continue talking about the United Nations and some of its operations on the continent. We'll talk to UN aides about some of their mission. Don't go away.
This is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories.
One of the things that we are seeing across the globe, people are consuming news and living their lives with their mobile devices.
The evolution of journalism is to use the same skills, the same ethics, the same values, but to cater to different audiences, because it's not the same people.
There is a lot of debate in this industry today whether the future is about digital paid content. Will there be a market for users to pay for digital content? And we see that in Africa it's a challenge.
People will go, pay for a newspaper, take it away. Why won't they pay for it online?
In the initial stages of shifting from print to online, we created the impression that what people were paying for was the paper. And so people are very reluctant to pay for the journalism, and good journalism is very expensive.
Watch Media Monitor Sundays at 9 a.m.
The women and the children of this great country are under siege.
I can hear the cries of women in the streets.
Women are dying with protection orders in their homes.
Women face the onslaught of an oppressor with a different face.
The scourge of violence against women is a dark stain in our nation.
I stand here today and I think of Valencia Farmer. I think of Uyinene. I think of Jesse Hess.
There must be harsher punishment for rape.
We've been mourning, we've been sympathizing with the women that were raped in our country.
Gender-based violence has reached extreme levels which can no longer be tolerated.
Don't strike your sisters. They are the mothers of tomorrow.
Our mothers have cried, our sisters have cried, our daughters have cried, and we are saying enough is enough.
Welcome back. You're watching African Perspective. We're discussing the United Nations. We're joined now by Dr. Mbulawa Mugabe, who is in our Pretoria studio to talk to us about UN AIDS. He's a country director. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Sepiso.
Obviously, you're talking about UN AIDS. We're talking about the AIDS epidemic in Africa. Is this still the characterization of your work here in Africa?
Well, yes, I mean, let me just pick off from where the resident coordinator left off about the UN delivering as one. What we normally call UNAIDS is actually a joint program of the United Nations, which brings together the efforts of about 11 UN agencies to try to deliver on a common platform, to deliver on a shared concern, and in this case, HIV. So we're actually pulling together both the resources and efforts of these agencies to tackle HIV. And as the resident coordinator said, we don't have a plan of our own. It's about the national plan, the national, goals that we are trying to address. And this is how we work in South Africa around HIV.
So let's talk about the lessons learned, with the epidemic since, say, 20 years ago. Agenda 2030 is still on the line in terms of harming the rate of infection. But what trends have you seen? What lessons have been learned?
As part of the Sustainable Development Goals, I think the international community has set a goal of actually ending AIDS by 2030 as a public health threat. And essentially what it means is that we need to tackle the epidemics of HIV, TB, and malaria, and make sure that by 2030, at least we managed to bring these epidemics under control. And the lessons we have learned in the past is that for you to do that, you need to set out very clear targets that you are going to work towards. And in 2016, the international community set out targets, interim targets to 2030, which was to set targets that we need to meet by 2020. And today, most of the national strategy, including South Africa, is making sure that we reach towards those targets. And I can tell you that we have learned a lot from HIV in the past few years, particularly in the past decades. South Africa in particular, we have been able to, for instance, quadruple the number of people on treatment between 2010 and 2018. And also in terms of new infections, we've been able to see a decline of 40% in this country because of some of the interventions that we've been putting in place. But let me also hasten to add that we have also learned that with every success, there are new challenges. One of the major challenges we have today is that there are a number of populations that are left behind in some of these successes. One of those is children. We are not putting enough children on treatment. We are not being able to reach young women and young girls. Men are absent in some of our treatment programs, and especially boys. So there are all these gaps, including the gaps that we are beginning to see within people that are living with HIV, who know their status, but they keep on dropping out of treatment. So we need to fix some of these leakages if we are going to reach the targets that the government or the nation has set itself. So we have learned a lot, but I think we have major challenges that I think we need to tackle in the coming months if we are going to reach it.
Let's talk about some of those challenges. Your own report of UNAIDS says there are 5 critical and uncertain forces driving AIDS in Africa. What are they?
One of the biggest driver of the AIDS epidemic in Africa is adolescent girls and young women. We need to do a lot to deal with this issue around the level of epidemic in this particular group. And that is why the Sustainable Development Goals are also talking about populations that are being left behind. In this continent, if we are talking about a population that is clearly left behind, if we are going to control this epidemic, is addressing the issue of adolescent girls and young women. And that means addressing other SDGs. It means addressing issues around education, issues around employment, because these are, and issues around poverty, because this is what actually drives the epidemic in this population group. If you look at what is happening across the world, the progress that we are making, including in South Africa, is not even. And if you look at countries that are making a lot of progress, is those countries that are actually pushing a combination of strategies. It cannot be a single strategy that is going to make the difference. But for those countries that are making less progress, is those countries that actually are dealing with significant human rights challenges around key populations, because this is where the epidemic is thriving today in most parts of the world.
It's very interesting that you say that, because Uganda has been such an example, but it's also because it's made tough choices. What choices has it made that countries like South Africa and other countries on the continent can learn from?
I think some of the tough choices that we need to make is, as I said, we really need to get back to the SDGs, because no single SDG would be achieved without addressing other SDGs. And one of those, and as I said, in a country like South Africa and across the African continent, is that if you don't deal with the issue of unemployment, issues of poverty, issues of gender-based violence, we'll never get ahead of this epidemic. So there are these basic things that we need to do and do right and fix some of those underlying causes. There's no magic bullet to get ahead of this epidemic if we don't address the social drivers of this epidemic. But in doing that, I think we also have to make sure that people living with HIV are central and actually driving this response. Why is it that today in a country like South Africa, people living with HIV are dropping out of treatment? We need to be asking ourselves those hard questions and be clear on what are the strategies that we're going to employ to make sure that people are comfortable going to the facilities and being able to stay on medication. So we need to fix some of those systemic problems that are actually holding us from making further progress.
So you spoke about education earlier on, and I'm just wondering, have you seen any changes that are required, especially in the generation and application of knowledge with regards to HIV/AIDS?
I think we are not seeing the kind of progress that we need to see in this particular age group. The age group 15 to 24 is the most critical to controlling this epidemic. Whether you are talking about young girls and women or boys, this is the generation that if we are not careful, we will lose this generation, not only to HIV, but lose it because we are not attending to some of the other basic problems that we need to do. I think we really need to put much more concerted effort, and this is where, for us as the UN system, we really need to know how we can actually pull our efforts to align behind government in trying to address some of the critical challenges that actually face in this particular age group. It can no longer be that we approach this epidemic like is something that is like wildfire. You need to be able to be very clear when you need to focus efforts, and those populations that we need to focus on have been clearly identified. Now we have to find specific interventions that actually respond to those specific challenges.
But does that point to a lack of evolution of values, meanings, or even just belief systems?
I think it's a combination of many things. I think you are right. I think we need to go to the values, particularly when it comes to issues of gender-based and issues around gender equality. We need to tackle those basic fundamental moral and critical issues that needs to be addressed. But in addition to that, as I say, it's about also moving in tandem with addressing some of the real structural drivers that are not just from the moral side, but more entrenched socio-economic challenges that we need to address as part of the development of the society. We have to see HIV as a critical development issue, that unless we deal with HIV, we'll never be able to address some of the challenges that we are dealing with in this country. Let's also remember that this is a country that has 20% of the global epidemic. So the amount of effort, the effort level in this country has to take a leap, so that we can actually deal with some of these critical problems. And that is what it also means is that we need to be able to find some of those key drivers that we need to address, which are part of the Sustainable Development Goals.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Mbulawa Mkabe, who is UNAIDS Country Director in South Africa. We'll be back shortly, don't go away.
You've got people salivating in my ear between my director and everybody else at the back.
This is Morning Live.
This is definitely going to be a special project.
So I wanted to create an awareness in Igama about
experiences that black women face on a daily basis that they either can't speak about or they tuck away in their memory.
The more and more women are wanting fit bodies for life, no matter their shape or size, we've been able to tap into that amazing energy.
This is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories.
One of the things that we are seeing across the globe, people are consuming news and living their lives with their mobile devices.
The evolution of journalism is to use the same skills, the same ethics, the same values, but to cater to different audiences because it's not the same people.
There is a lot of debate in this industry today whether the future is about digital paid content. Will there be a market for users to pay for digital content? And we see that in Africa it's a challenge.
People will go, pay for a newspaper, take it away. Why won't they pay for it online?
In the initial stages of shifting from print to online, we created the impression that what people were paying for was the paper. And so people are very reluctant to pay for the journalism, and good journalism is very expensive.
Watch Media Monitor Sundays at 9 a.m.
Day one of the Russia-Africa summit has wrapped up in Sochi, where 40 heads of state from Africa, including President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, are holding talks with President Vladimir Putin. The day saw President Ramaphosa hold a bilateral meeting with his Russian counterpart, and trade and military cooperation were a very big focus of this. Neha Punya filed this report from the ground in Sochi.
It's Russia's biggest push yet to woo Africa, a chance to regain influence lost after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Playing host to 43 leaders from Africa, President Vladimir Putin got straight down to business. Russia-Africa trade more than doubled over the last 5 years, crossing $20 billion.
That is not sufficient for our relations with all of Africa, nor is it sufficient for our bilateral ties. The figure is too small. We can do a lot more. I'm hopeful that today's contacts will boost our development and growth.
President Putin says expanding trade with South Africa is the top priority. Last year, bilateral trade grew by 28%, but adds up to only $1 billion. Moscow claims it wants to double trade with Africa in the next 5 years, a move welcomed by President Ramaphosa.
I appreciate your effort in bringing together all these African countries, and obviously the platform that we are utilizing is economic development, and we appreciate that. As Africa being part of this effort, the Africa Free Trade Area presents an opportunity for African countries to participate with Russia in a meaningful way.
Experts say Russia doesn't have the spending capacity that the US and China do, but plagued with sanctions from the West and a stagnating economy at home, it's hoping to make inroads in Africa.
Russia needs to seek new partnerships. We have no choice. Africa is growing rapidly, and I think it makes a lot of sense for Russia as a new global power to pay attention to growing economies.
But despite President Putin's trade push, Russia is gunning for an even bigger role in Africa. Hours after Mr. Putin's meeting with President Ramaphosa, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed Moscow sent 2 supersonic Blackjack bomber jets to South Africa, a rare display of military cooperation. The aircraft is capable of flying 12,000 kilometers without refueling and can carry 12 short-range nuclear missiles. It's the first time such jets have flown from Russia to South Africa, and as President Putin offers unconditional help to the African nations without any strings attached, it's clearly playing to its military strength. As Russia embraces Africa, it says it wants the continent to lead the way and set terms of engagement. The message from the Kremlin seems to be that while it may have been late to the Africa scramble, it is here to stay. Neha Punya, SABC News, Sochi, Russia.
Meanwhile, the Russia-Africa summit has been described by many analysts as a new scramble for Africa. Sarah Kimani spoke to international relations expert Professor Macharia Munene in this report.
The two-day summit will bring together over 3,000 delegates from across Russia and Africa. Among those in attendance are 43 heads of state and government, and Russia will be following in the footsteps of other big powers, including Japan, China, France, the European Union and the US.
And Africa is one of those parts that they have to relate to. One, for the resources that they need for their own growth, development, and two, for international political leverage. That you need allies.
In his address to the summit, Vladimir Putin told African leaders that he hopes to double trade between Russia and the continent. Currently, its trade with Africa stands at $20 billion, a drop in the ocean compared to China's $205 billion. The country has dominated arms sales to Africa at $15 billion. Apart from defense cooperation, Russia will be seeking to sign bilateral agreements on trade.
Maybe more cooperation in terms of technological development, maybe more of the infrastructure undertaking,
energy.
Maybe it's time African countries went nuclear.
Russia is a shareholder of the Afrexim Bank since 2017 in what is seen as a way of changing its relations with the continent to be more business-centered. Putin told the meeting that he's seeking cooperation with Africa without political or other interference. Experts, however, caution that the continent must go to Sochi with her eyes open.
All these 40 leaders are going there. Whom are they going with? They taking people who go and drink wine in the evening and contribute nothing to the discussion, which it has been said that that's one of the weaknesses with the African delegations. They take people who really have no idea what they're doing because it's a joyride.
Whether a belated entry into the scramble for Africa, this week's summit will be seen as Russia seeking to shift the balance to her favor, some even terming Putin as an opportunist. Sarah Kimani, SABC News, Kenya.
And in other news, Russia has landed two of the world's biggest military aircrafts in South Africa, this in a display of cooperation between the defense forces of both South Africa and Russia. The aircrafts landed at Waterkloof Air Force Base in what has been described as an historic visit by the Russian Air Force to the South African Air Force.
An 11,000-kilometer flight lasting 13 hours. Finally, the two bombers, capable of launching nuclear missiles, landed. This is a first for South Africa, and it is expected that a number of other Russian military aircraft will also arrive in the country.
The visit is only a military cooperation and coordination between the two countries, and we're looking forward to strengthen this military relationship between ourselves and Russia. We were very happy. And we are also feel proud to represent our country in the aviation fraternity.
The bombers had initially scheduled to land on Tuesday, but were delayed on 2 occasions. But the military authorities say their presence here is to build mutually beneficial partnerships based on common interests with SANDF.
Самолеты Ту-160 выполнили это беспосадочный полет с одной дозаправкой в воздухе в районе Каспийского моря.
Our bombers, they covered this distance without any stop. They did refueling in the air above Caspian Sea.
The military aircrafts are named after Andrei Tupolev, a pioneering aircraft designer. The Russians' visit aims to boost the aviation relations between the two countries. Karabo Masombuga, SABC News, Pretoria.
The Zimbabwean government believes that the country's crippled economy will begin to recover halfway through 2020. It projects that the current situation will worsen before it gets better. It's expected that the economy will contract by 6% for the rest of the year. Nobalani and Effort Musekiwa compiled this report.
There seems to be no respite for Zimbabwe's struggling economy. Effects of the drought on agriculture and electricity production, the impact of Cyclone Idai, and the lack of investments are to blame for the poor performance. The high levels of corruption, the lack of foreign currency and cash shortages are also hampering recovery efforts. The country's inflation rate was recorded above 300% in August, the second highest in the world.
Our projection by year end is minus 6.5%. And why? The shock from the drought caused by El Nino is quite deep and severe. Its secondary impact on hydropower production is known to all. The power outages have been quite severe. But also what has happened is that now resources that could have gone elsewhere now need to be diverted towards importation of grain. We have to import 850,000 metric tons for maize and another large amount for wheat. Easily they're talking well over 1 million tons of grain that need to be imported. Something applies to power. Now we're even seeing an issue where, even if you've got the resources to pay for the power, at least from South Africa, we can't even get the power, the adequate power that we require.
Analysts warn that there doesn't seem to be a possibility of improving the economic status of the country in the near future.
Zimbabwe is not producing at the moment. If you look at the numbers, just looking at the mining sector, for example, almost 9 major commodities in terms of minerals, they are facing southwards in terms of output. You look at the foreign currency shortages, how they are hampering the mining sector growth in the country.
In efforts to address foreign currency shortages, the government introduced currency reforms in February and in June reintroduced the Zimbabwean dollar. These reforms have so far been unpopular and have had adverse effects on the consumer base.
Whether the current currency project, I think that's how you really put it, is working or not. Yes, it is working. Think about what we've achieved. Basically, we've restored competitiveness in our currency. Previously, if we were earning $1 in terms of exports as an exporter, of course that was the US dollars. And now you're earning 15 times that in terms of the new exchange rate. That's what weakening a currency does in terms of export competitiveness. But also it means that as a base, as a manufacturing base, Zimbabwe is now cheaper than before and cheaper than the rest of the region as a manufacturing base. So we should really take advantage of that and try to turn Zimbabwe into a manufacturing hub for the region.
People always have different opinions in terms of economic management, but introduction of a local currency was never a right move at this hour, regardless of the threats which were being posed to the government of having a US dollar economy. I think we have theories explaining that reintroducing US dollar will wipe away almost 50% of gross domestic product of this economy. But at the same time, I think remaining with a local currency, it will continue pushing away savings. I think Zimbabweans have walked this route not more than 10 or 11 years ago. I think the pensions were decimated, where the financial sector, where the savings are now even today in negative of almost 4% of gross domestic product. So local currency mismanagement, especially through broad money supply increase in an economy, is what we are witnessing at the moment, leading to somehow a depreciation of the exchange rate. And we will not be surprised even to see the exchange rate moving towards 30 by year end.
Government austerity measures are expected to last until December this year, and the economy is expected to start rebounding in the first half of 2020. Noma Bolani, SABC News.
And that's all we had time for on African Perspective this Wednesday. Thank you so much for joining us. From all of us here in Studio 11, good night.